I think the net of all this was that there were divided loyalties among the generation of Versus users. I think that still persists actually. It was impossible to not acknowledge VS.net as a great technical achievement, but it was also impossible to say that every customer was pleased with the direction. Whatever else you say though, the 2002 offering became the new foundation for tools innovation at Microsoft, and it began a new era in AI development here. One in which a key distinguishing factor was the presence of rich graphical designers for virtually every development task. It was in this release that the notion that it was enough to simply throw up a text editor and call it good became insufficient. Arguably, even now, Visual Studio's bevy of designers are a key aspect of its success. Not long after Visual Studio Net, I returned to the developer division, ILL. Pick up the story at the Whidbey release in the next part. Part 7. I know I promised to talk about Whidbey in this installment, but I realized I needed a bridge to get there, or else I'd totally skip over Everett. So this is that bridge. In Mission, the arrival of the Net framework and Visual Studio Net was like a breath of fresh air. My team was working on, among other things, a COM-based object model for a content management system. I once estimated that fully half the code was associated with the implementation of unknown and direct or aggregated cases. Let us hear it for puncounter or else tricky ref count management, to say nothing of the similar code that was in every client. Using the old code as a reference, just one developer was able to re-implement the entirety of the interfaces, save one class which we chose to wrap with COM interrupt instead, in about 3 months. While it is true that I have a high opinion of her, you know who you are, I think this was a great example of the Net framework shining in its strong areas. The resulting libraries integrated seamlessly with ASP.NET naturally and were maybe the sides with superior performance. One should never discount the cost of all those interlocked increments and COM objects and all the small allocations and long-term fragmentation. Fragmentation, or rather lack of it, was another key benefit we got from the Net stack in the time frame. Until then it had been the bane of our existence, with 72-hour tests frequently showing performance degrading over time. We found that we got 5x the speed of regular ASP and stable performance over time. We had other systems, formerly written in Perl, that we were again able to rewrite and see in a fraction of the time. A key benefit was the strong Unicode support that Net offered. We just weren't getting what we needed out of the Perl implementations we had, to say nothing of the threading benefits. Debugging it was a dream compared to the old world. In less than 6 months we had an all-new data pump, an all-new managed content management system, both scalable and more reliable than either of the previous systems. Life was good. So I decided I should give up on Mission and go work on the CLR. I don't think they ever forgave me. By the time I joined the CLR, fall of 2002, their work on Everett aka Visual Studio Net Framework 1.1 was nearly done. It didn't release until the spring, but things were winding down there, and so I started working on Whidbey almost right away, but I don't want to just gloss over Everett because some important stuff happened. C is a moving target. I guess all non-dead languages share that property, but perhaps C is a lot more robust in this regard than many other modern languages. As a result, there is almost always standards catch-up work a compiler team should be doing. In this case it was around partial templates. This stuff makes my brain hurt. But I guess it should hurt. C templates are Turing complete. Frankly, I was amazed by what the C team had managed to accomplish in the time they had. The needs of managed C and E just works managed support. But there was a lot more in Everett despite the fact that it was supposed to be a minor update. For instance, Everett introduced support for managed code on mobile devices. I can't believe I am saying that, like you just push the Go mobile button on Net and out pops NetCF and all the compilers, debuggers, emulators, and deployment tools just like that. I think they made it look too easy. Everett also introduced the Enterprise Architect version with the first ML support in our systems, maybe foreshadowing VSTS. Designers were definitely here to stay. But truthfully I couldn't say very much about Everett because I was desperately trying to learn about the runtime and getting ready for Whidbey. Meanwhile, Managed Code Mania was at its zenith at Microsoft. Sometimes it seemed like every product was trying to find a way to incorporate the .NET framework into their plans. Part 8 I can't really talk about what was going on in the IDE without covering what was happening in the runtime because their fates are so intertwined, so even though it is off topic a little bit, allow me to cover some details from Framework 2.0. Longhorn, which became Windows Vista, was probably the single greatest influence on the developer division during the years when .NET Framework 2.0 and Visual Studio 2005 collectively Whidbey were being developed. I think I could write several books on those years as a study in being too successful for your own good. As I wrote earlier, there was a certain mania in managed code adoption during that time and, though ultimately some of those efforts had to be scrapped, many were positive influence on the toolchain. Anecdote that's not really important to the story, but just for fun I can't resist telling you about my first day on the job when I joined the CLR performance team. I had been working for the last 7 years in the mission area, with a great emphasis on server workloads, data architectures, and so forth. So I was a bit surprised when on day 1 I was told I was going to be working on our client performance problems. That is a Whiskey Tango Foxtrot moment. Pays to be flexible. I guess client workloads were a lot harder on the .NET framework at that time. We did have an end story, but it needed a lot of work. Putting as much code as possible into readily shared DLLs is fundamentally necessary to getting reasonable memory usage on the client. Much less of an issue on dedicated servers, for instance. Contrariwise, code sharing is even more essential on a terminal server with potentially hundreds of users running client applications. Sharing also vitally important to flagship applications, like Visual Studio, that are trying to get their code loaded as quickly as possible using technologies like Superfetch. It is a pretty simple chain of events, JIT code. Can be shared? Unshared code uses more memory, use too much memory and you're dead. Sharing is good. We had to do more of it. It was doubly important because major new framework elements were being developed while this was all going on. Things like Windows Presentation Foundation, WPF, and Windows Communication Foundation, WCF, to name a few. The base class library BCL was gaining support for generics starring my favorite nullable, and XML use was exploding in all parts of the stack. I used to joke that if angle brackets less than greater than had never been invented I would have no performance issues to work on. If only it were true. In the universe of technologies requiring tool support we really should add at least 2 more. There were yet more improvements to ASP.NET. There were compelling 64-bit architectures x64 and e64, and, probably most difficult of all the considerations, there was SQL Server 2005 Yukon, which introduced SQL CLR, allowing users to write stored procedures in managed code. Again, I could write whole books on what was going on in the runtime components, but I am trying to stay focused on Visual Studio for this series, so I think that is probably enough landscape setting. As it is with all those changes, it is easy to see why Whidbey took nearly 3 years. For starters, there were whole new project and deployment types needed to support the new ASP.NET with its own new developer server, and likewise for the SQL scenarios. And while I am on the topic of project and deployment, this is also where Clickins makes its debut. Clickins had to permeate our project systems, but its introduction also highlighted an inherent weakness. Despite the extensibility offered in the project space, there was indeed no one central place Clickins deployment could be added so that all project types would benefit. This is a classic example of why ongoing refactoring/remodeling of architecture is so important. Personal note: my first direct interaction with the Visual Studio team during this time period was working on the performance of the Create New Project dialog, something which can never quite go fast enough to make us happy. Okay, so the project system needed work. What else? Well, anytime you add pretty much anything you can expect the debugger to be affected. This was no exception. Generics, Check. Needs debugging support. SQL CLR? Check. Needs debugging support. It was a long list. But there was even more than just that going on. I have written earlier about the challenges of what we call interrupt debugging, where you debug both managed and unmanaged code at the same time. In this release, both the debugger and runtime teams put considerable effort into making interrupt debugging more reliable. That meant taking a very hard look at all the communications logic, the locking model, the safe stopping points versus skid points, as I called them. It was a huge endeavor, but as a result interrupt debugging got noticeably better in VS 2005. All this hard work actually had an unexpected extra bonus. We also introduced a managed code profiler in this time frame, and as it turns out, trying to stop managed code as it runs so that you can walk the stack the way profilers like to do tends to have all the same kinds of problems as trying to stop the code in a debugging context. As a result, much of the hard work that went into getting the debugger working resulted in a more effective profiler solution. I should come back to SQL 2005 support. It isn't enough to just add project and debugging features, but ADO.NET 2.0 was making its appearance, and that requires suitable designers. Visual Studio perhaps earns its name more so than its antecedent Visual Basic because it is visual in many different ways. Just visual forms no longer suffices. New SQL engine means data designers are a must. As if all of that wasn't enough, there were two brand new pieces of technology that appeared during this time as well. These were part of our Office programming story: Vista and FSTO. In a few words, Vista is tooling for IceFS to provide scripting features to their users, allowing their users to write managed language programs that automating their product. The primary user is clearly Office, but in principle anyone can participate. You get a complete authoring experience with it. FSTO, in contrast, allows you to write Office extensions, intended to be written as native code against a COM API, using managed languages instead. That poor sentence hardly does justice to the difficulty of achieving this result, and I am glossing over the fact that there were other FSTO solutions as far back as 2003, but this is where I remember the spotlight first shining on that technology with any kind of luminosity. But, even with all this good work, there was one thing that stands out in my memory as being more important than all the others. Edit and Continue was back. And there was great rejoicing. Part 9. In the last posting I talked about the would-be release, VS 2005, but I feel like I left out two really important aspects, so I'd like to start this part by ruining a bit for those two topics. I had mentioned in Part 7 that some of the UML support in the ever time frame was starting to foreshadow the release of VSTS. Well, in would-be there is no foreshadowing disclaimer necessary. VSTS arrives, and I think at that point it is clear that Microsoft is going to try to have a real offering in the space. I think it is fair to say that the venerable VSS was not going to be the product to carry us into the 21st century. I don't want to understate the difficulty of bringing just TFS to market, and that is only one part of the equation, but even giving those hard-working folks a well-deserved nod, I felt like the first VSTS was just a taste of at this time, whetting the appetite as it were. But even so, with so many shops wanting to formalize their practices in some way, even lightweight practices like Scrum, this kind of support was welcome relief. I think those years included a much greater level of attention to the process of creating software than at any other time in my experience. Just 4 years after its initial 2005 release, VSTS is a huge part of what we deliver. And in 2002 it didn't even exist. I started my discussion about the would-be release with an observation about how big of an influence Windows Vista was on our tools. I think I should have ended with my single biggest regret about that release because it is highly related. Despite its huge influence, our support for Windows Vista was lousy in the initial release, like really lousy. It wasn't until we delivered SP1 and especially the Vista support for SP1 pack that we got to a reasonable level of support. I could make a bunch of excuses, but they all sound pathetic to me, so I'll just stick with it as my one regret. Okay, so much for the downer part of the article. Let us move on to Visual Studio. 2008 Orcus. The thing that I most remember about Orcus is MQ, the quality milestone. This is where we spent the equivalent of an entire coding just taking care of nagging issues that otherwise seem to not get handled. I'll name drop again. Since I just linked her video, I'd have to say it was Carol more than anyone else that was keeping us honest about the debt we had accumulated in our product and popularizing that meme in our division. Debt is a great way to think about trade-offs every time you make a choice that isn't right in the long term. Any shortcut, accumulate some debt. Any bug you choose to defer, that is debt. Some debt you should write off, that fix just isn't happening. Some you should address, but always you should be aware that you'll have to deal with it sooner or later, and it may as well be sooner. That mindset, which was the focus of MQ, was pervasive for the whole release, and I think it shows. From a stability and performance perspective, VS 2008 was universally better than 2005. A very hard thing to achieve in any major release, with significant additions. I think the star of VS 2008 was Link. My favorite flavor was Link to SQL, which I've written about at some length before. Perhaps the most amazing thing about Link is that its introduction into both C and VB allowed mainstream programmers to start using functional concepts in a natural way, often without even realizing it. But a close second are two other amazing things. One, Link variants Link to XXX started appearing like crazy. The notation was incredibly useful too. You could actually get great performance out of this kind of layer without inflicting craziness on users. See my article again for the Link to SQL discussion. In the same way that the needs of high-quality designers drove advances like partial classes critical for code separation, Link variants and their needs drove the type inference, extension methods, and expression tree features, including concise lambda notation, necessary for its success into the mainstream languages. This brings great collateral benefits because those exact same notions are helpful in so many other scenarios. I use them pervasively in my WPF code for event handling, for instance. As usual, this all comes at a cost. It's not just language notation, it's also the debugging support, profiling, garbage collection, FXCOP, and so on. After all, just because a method is dynamically generated, has no name, and no PDB file information, don't mean you don't want to analyze it like the others. And of course, the ability to generate expression trees in addition to Illinois represents another significant undertaking for the compilers. All of this is fundamentally necessary for Link to succeed, but it's kind of invisible. It's the stuff you expect to just work. Orcus also included the CIDR designer for WPF. Remember that during this period there had been several runtime releases including 3.0, and it shipped alongside 3.5 of the framework. Well, by the WPF was a first-class application target, and it needed designer support, and the richness of WPF resulted in perhaps one of the most complicated designers ever created. It is doubtful that a successful designer could have been created if not for the lessons from Sparkle aka Expression Blend, and language advances like partial classes to ease things along. The abundance of framework subsets led to the need for multi-targeting. That is, the ability of the tool to target any one of several framework versions, or to have solutions with projects targeting arbitrary combinations. This was tricky enough in Orcus, but at least the frameworks all shared a common core, simplifying things significantly. That grace would be absent in the follow-on release VS 2010. Other application models were popping up as well. Silverlight had made its debut, taking WPF concepts to the web, and Windows Workflow WF also delivered a release in a designer. If it wasn't already de facto reality, the general theme that every application model needs a suitable design experience was certainly cemented during this period. Debugging technology takes itself to new amazing places like XSLT debugging. XSLT makes my head hurt even more than Apple and gains the ability to debug into the BCL and dynamically download the sources needed to do the job. Very slick, but by now you know I am partial to debugging technology J. And on the native code front, MFC9 makes its appearance, adding support for new Vista concepts, and representing the first significant update to MFC in a very long time. But for me the biggest memories are just working on performance across the board, from MQ to the finish. In the framework, in the tools, we made big dents in many scenarios and overall, even with lots of new features, Orcus felt snappier than Webby, which was a great accomplishment. I loved using it. I just hit 1200 words, so I think it is time to stop, having skipped vast regions. And barely mentioned VSTS, I'll pick up again in a bit. Thank you for all the feedback and comments, they are much appreciated.